All right. Hello, business ethics students. In this video, we're going to talk about Veltman on what makes work meaningful, Codrearado on the anti-work movement, and 80,000 hours on what makes for a high-impact job. But before we get to the specific ideas that these pieces offer about what makes for good work, what makes for a good job or a good approach to work, perhaps, I think it would help to start, if you can, from your own experiences, right? Can you think of a job where you thrived? Right? Whatever that means to you. Did it mean that you have a lot of fun? Were you really highly motivated? Did you feel very strongly about the work that you were doing? Did you feel like you were really like in your element? Like this was a place where you could really get in the zone and you could really I don't know, be your best self or exercise some skills or something that that you're proud to exercise. This might not be an easy question to answer. You might not have a lot of work experience. Maybe if you don't have a lot of work experience, you can think about school situations, classroom situations, or maybe even volunteering situations where you thrived. But I want you to sort of keep your own personal experiences in the back of your head while we're talking through these things, because you might want to sort of compare notes between what in your experience has been good work and the accounts of good work that we get from the pieces that you're reading for this week. Okay, let's turn to Veltman first, then we'll talk about Codrearado a little bit, and then we'll talk about 80,000 hours. Okay. Veltman, in What Makes Work Meaningful, notes correctly that work is an important part of our lives, and that one of the things we say we want out of work is that we want it to be meaningful. But it's not obvious what that means. It's not obvious what we want when we want work to be meaningful. Veltman says that there's no simple, cut and dried little definition that you can give of meaningfulness. Instead, she says you have to evaluate the meaningfulness of some work along 4 dimensions that she distinguishes. So there are 4 different ways that work can be more or less meaningful. You might ask yourself, if you're in a philosophical mood, why meaningfulness has to be broken down into these 4 different dimensions. Why 4 dimensions? Why not 10? Why not 1? But before we get to sort of criticizing or raising questions about Veltman's view, let's try to understand it. I'll say one little note, which I think is going to be relevant to your writing assignment, which is based on these readings, is that jobs can be more or less meaningful on each of these dimensions. Maybe every job is a little bit meaningful on at least one of these dimensions, and maybe more. So when you're thinking about meaningful work, you should be thinking about what sorts of jobs satisfy these dimensions to an especially high degree. What sorts of jobs do these things really well? Okay. Let's turn to these dimensions then. Okay. So the first dimension that she distinguishes is this. She writes, quote, "Work is meaningful when it develops and exercises the capabilities, skills, and talents of workers." And, this isn't always 100% explicit or 100% obvious, but there's this long tradition in philosophy of thinking that exercising your talents or developing your capabilities is an important part, maybe it's all there is, to leading a good life. And, this intuitively makes some sense. If you think that, there's somebody who could have been a great musician or could have been a great basketball player or a great scientist or whatever, and they, because of their life circumstances, don't get a chance to exercise those talents or those skills or fully develop those capabilities, there's something sort of sad about that. There's something regrettable about that. And so this dimension is tapping into this and is using the idea of meaningfulness to keep track of it. So, work is whatever else it is. It's a place where you get to develop, at least to a greater or lesser extent, where you get to develop your capabilities. Of course, you can do this outside of work, but at work you get to learn work-specific skills, but you might also get to learn sort of more general transferable life skills about getting on along with other people and sticking to a schedule and so on and so forth. So this is the first dimension of meaningfulness. I'll say there's a tricky sort of philosophical question here, which Veltman understandably doesn't go into at great length in this little piece, which is that some capabilities seem to count more than others. They seem to be more desirable to develop than others, right? So, I mean, to take a sort of silly example, right? Imagine that you could become, with a little bit of practice, you could become the greatest sleeper of all time. You could sleep more than anybody else in human history. I mean, that's a capability that you could develop. But it's not clear that your life would be any more meaningful, or if you develop this as part of work, that your work would be any more meaningful if you became the greatest sleeper of all time. And you could think of other sorts of examples, but it raises this question, like, well, why? What distinguishes the sorts of capabilities that the development or exercise of which contributes to making your life or your work more meaningful from those capabilities which are sort of trivial or besides the point? Is it something about how important the capability is for yourself or for the wider society? Is it just any capability that you want to develop? Those are questions that you might ask if you were trying to refine or clarify or work Veltman's theory into a form that you could really live with, that you could really adopt. Okay, that's the first dimension of meaningfulness for Veltman. Does work give you the opportunity to develop, exercise your capabilities, talents, and skills? Okay, the second dimension, which could sound similar but is, I think, different, is, she writes, that work is meaningful when it supports virtues such as pride, honor, and dignity. Okay, virtues, philosophers sometimes like to talk about virtues. This can sound sort of old-fashioned. I think it can sound like, your Queen Victoria or something. But a virtue is not necessarily an old-fashioned idea. It's just anything that helps make you a better person. So if being an honest person virtue is any kind of character trait, I should say, that helps make you a better person. So if being honest or generous or kind or being a good listener or being forgiving or being fair-minded or open-minded, those are all characteristics that a person can have that they sort of carry with them throughout their lives to a greater or lesser extent, that, at least according to common sense, or at least according to a lot of people, help make you a better person. It's, other things being equal, it's better to be open-minded than to be closed-minded. Other things being equal, better to be honest than dishonest. Okay, so what does this have to do with work? Well, I mean, work is, again, among other things, a place where you have, at least sometimes, an opportunity to develop some things that are, according to common sense, considered virtues. So, work gives you the opportunity to develop the character traits of being a dependable or reliable person, being an industrious or productive person, being a disciplined person, somebody who can keep yourself to a schedule, or keep yourself to commitments, or keep yourself to doing things even if you have sort of momentary temptations that want to sort of pull you away. And, being disciplined, industrious, dependable, reliable, those are all, at least according to common sense, for most people in the US in 2022, virtues. They're things, they're character traits that help make you a better person. And, it's notable that jobs can give you an opportunity to develop or cultivate your virtues, or they could do the opposite. They could develop or cultivate your vices, things that could contribute to making you a worse person. So a job might call on you to be cruel or deceptive or cynical. Those are all things that, again, intuitively or according to common sense for a lot of people, are vices. They're things that make you, other things being equal, a worse person. So, one job is going to be more meaningful than another to the extent that it encourages you to develop not just your skills and talents, like being good at tennis or whatever, but your sort of moral virtues, character traits that make you a morally better person. Okay. Fair enough. Of course, different people have different views about what makes for a virtue. Some people think loyalty is a virtue. Some people think loyalty, well, that's clannishness or tribalism. That's just giving special consideration to your friends and screwing over other people. But, at least relative to whatever you think virtues are, or whatever the virtues happen to be, work can develop those virtues better or worse. And that's one way that a job can be more or less meaningful, according to Veltman. Okay. The third dimension of meaningfulness that she distinguishes is, quote, work is meaningful when it produces something useful or purposeful. I think this is probably pretty close to what a lot of people think of when they think of meaningful work. The meaning of your work is something like the purpose of your work. It's what it's for. It's what it aims to produce. So if to the extent that your work is purposeful, that it produces something useful, then good. And to the extent that it doesn't, it's less meaningful. I think one thing that's sort of interesting is that in at least some psychological, not so much philosophical, studies of meaningful work, people have found that workers are more likely to consider their work meaningful, not just if their own contribution is especially purposeful or useful, if not just if they can sort of specify, oh, well, this is what I did, this is how I shaped the world, today at work, but if they believe in the organization, that they're working for. So even if your work contributes in an obscure or hard to recognize or tiny way to the mission of the organization, you might still regard your work as meaningful if you say, I really believe in, CUNY, for example, and I think, working for CUNY is, I'm contributing to this organization's mission, which is a good one. And yeah, I mean, in the case of CUNY, yeah, I do believe in CUNY. I do think that it's a good institution, and that's part of why I like working for it. Part of why I'd rather work for CUNY than work for, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, whatever. Okay. Again, there's a philosophical question here which we could ask, which in a way is sort of more directly taken up by the 80,000 hours reading, which is like, okay, well, what makes one job more useful or purposeful than another? I mean, how do you compare the purposefulness or usefulness of some of one career path, or for that matter, one organization with another? We'll turn to that when we turn to 80,000 hours in a little bit. The last dimension of meaningfulness that Veltman distinguishes is that work is meaningful when it, quote, integrates elements of a worker's life, such as by building or reflecting personal relationships. Okay. This is, again, it kind of intuitively makes sense, sort of making your life sort of harmonious, making all the parts of your life fit together. But there are different ways of understanding what this could mean. So maybe it means that the values or projects that you pursue in different parts of your life tend to reinforce one another rather than pulling against one another. So, maybe you're at home, and in your interactions with your friends, you have the same sorts of values, or you're trying to improve the world perhaps in the same sort of way that you do at work. You don't have one set of values at work and another set, at home or at church or whatever. Maybe it means that you can, what it means to integrate the different parts of your life is that you can tell a story about how they all fit together, that you can, that your life takes the form of a story rather than a series of sort of disconnected scenes. Okay, that's one possibility. Maybe it means that you have a single persona or a single personality, a single character that you carry with you from work to home and elsewhere. And that, work doesn't require you to be somebody else, somebody that you're not in the rest of your life. I'll say that it's not obvious to me why integrating your life in any of these sorts of ways is actually valuable, like actually something worth doing, right? So, maybe you pursue different sorts of projects at home and at work, and they don't fit together in any obvious way, or they don't reinforce each other. Well, so what? Why is that a problem? Maybe you can't tell a coherent story out of your life. Maybe your life is just a sort of a series of scenes, and they don't add up to anything story-like. Okay, so what? Why should my life be a story? Why should I care about that? Maybe you're a very different sort of person at work and at home. I mean, to some extent, we all are. I'm not talking to you the same way that I talk to my parents, or that I talk to my friends, or that I talk to service workers that I encounter at the supermarket or the bodega or whatever. I mean, again, it's not clear what would be especially good or valuable about integrating your life in that way, about having a single personality that you carry with you from one situation to the next. Why not be different characters in different situations? Okay, so that's not an argument. I'm not giving you a sort of conclusive knockdown reason to think that Veltman is wrong, but I think it's a question that's worth asking. What is it actually valuable to integrate your life in any sense across, work and the other spheres of activity that you occupy? And if it is, why? And if it's not, then, why not? That's a philosophical question that's worth asking. I think the sort of example that Veltman tends to give of meaningless work, relatively meaningless work, is sort of drudgery, where you're acting like a cog in a machine. You're acting sort of automatically. I think of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where one of Charlie's either his parents or his grandparents, like, they have a job screwing the caps onto tubes of toothpaste, and that's their work. And I think, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that's supposed to be like a kind of over the top example of like a grim and grinding and I think Veltman would say meaningless job. And I think it's worth asking, well, is that an especially meaningless job? What makes it meaningless? Is it that, well, it doesn't necessarily give you an opportunity to develop a lot of skills. It develops the skill of screwing toothpaste caps onto toothpaste tubes, but it doesn't give you the opportunity to develop other more specialized skills. Okay. Does it give you the opportunity to exercise virtue? Well, some virtues, perhaps, the virtue of showing up on time, being a reliable person, and so on. But, not other sorts of virtues. It doesn't require you to be, for example, a friendly person or an honest person in your dealings with other people. Okay. Does it integrate the values that you have across different parts of your life? Probably not. Does it do something useful for the world? Well, toothpaste caps need to go on the toothpaste tubes, so it does something useful. Who's to say that that's any more or less useful than something else? Well, we need some criteria that Veltman doesn't quite give us for evaluating these sorts of things. Okay, so I think it's worth looking at some particular examples and asking, is this sort of more or less of examples of particular jobs or particular careers, and asking yourself, is this more or less meaningful than the average job? Than I don't know, pick a job out of a hat, or take the job that you're currently doing if you're currently employed. Okay. So that is Veltman. There are these 4 dimensions of meaningfulness: exercising talents and skills and capabilities, developing virtues, character traits that help make you a better person, um, doing something useful or purposeful for the world, and integrating the different elements of your life in one way or another. Okay, these are the 4 dimensions of meaningfulness that we get from Veltman. Turning to Codrea-Rado, just for a second, I think, this is a sort of introduction to the anti-work movement. And I think there's a lot that we could say about anti-work. What does it get right or wrong? What is this movement about? What is it, and is it correct or incorrect? I think we could also ask a sort of half historical, half philosophical question, which is like, why this now? Why anti-work, in 2021, 2022, not, 1975 or something? What is it about the current historical moment that gives rise to this kind of sentiment of people pushing back against work, against trying to the people who are trying to sort of somehow limit the role that work plays in their larger lives? I should say, in the US, we're talking about anti-work, and more recently we're talking about quiet quitting. We talked about this a little bit in one of the classes, that quiet quitting is in the labor movement used to be called working to rule, doing exactly what the job description requires of you and nothing more. That's in English in the United States, but there are other similar movements elsewhere in the world. So in China, there's a movement called lying flat or lying down, which is I believe pronounced Tang Ping, and it's a similar sort of thing. It's people who are think that it's good to limit the role that work plays in their lives, even if that comes at the cost of some material comforts, having a bunch of money or something like that. I think it's there's a lot that we could say about these movements, but in the context of this discussion of good work and what makes for a meaningful job or what makes for a high impact job, I think it's interesting to ask whether the desire for meaningful work is sort of asking too much of work. Whether it's a mistake to ask for work to be the source of these kinds of meaningfulness in our lives, rather than trying to get these sorts of meaningfulness from our friendships or our family relationships, or volunteering, or our interactions with our local communities, or our civic or political lives, or something like that. So of course, you can do both of those things. There's nothing that's preventing you, other than having limited time on Earth. There's nothing that's preventing you from seeking meaningfulness in these various ways from work, as well as from family and friendships and civic life and religious life and so on and so forth. But maybe one way of putting the question is, why not think that we should work as little as possible and then try to make the rest of our lives meaningful? Is there Is there some way in which when we're asking for work to be meaningful, or asking for it, for example, to integrate all the elements of our lives, we might be asking too much? And how do you answer that question? I'm just throwing that question out there. I don't have a very definite answer for myself, but I think that's something that's worth asking. We shouldn't just sort of assume that we want work to be this sort of source of meaning, and jump headfirst into getting it. Maybe we should ask whether work is the right place to look. for these sorts of meaning. Okay. That's really all I wanted to say about Cotre Rado. We can talk about other philosophical questions about the anti-work movement or lying flat or quiet quitting if you like, but that's all I wanted to bring up for the purposes of this video. Let's turn now for the end of the video to the 80,000 Hours reading. So 80,000 Hours is this organization associated with a movement that's called effective altruism. And effective altruists are people who try to, in a kind of evidence-based way, at least that's the idea, do the most good that they can with their lives. And since you're going to spend a lot of your time at work, and a lot of the ways that you are going to shape the world are through work rather than through your family life, home life, etc. Effective altruists are interested in this question. Well, how can you use your career to do the most good for the world, to have the highest impact that you can, for the better, that you can have on the world? And this is a really interesting question. And I think it can, when you take it seriously or you think about it hard enough, it can pull you in some very strange, unconventional directions. You might wind up, as I think many effective altruists do, reaching the conclusion that the highest impact jobs you could have or careers you could pursue are pretty weird ones, pretty unconventional ones, pretty different from what you might sort of grown up wanting to do or something like that. So there's a quote near the beginning of the piece which distinguishes the three main factors that they think can shape the impact that your career has. And we'll take each of these one by one and sort of break them down into their different components. So the first factor is how pressing the problems are that you focus on, that your career path focuses on. The scale of the contribution the path lets you make to tackling those problems, and your personal fit for the path, your personal fit for the career that you're choosing. Okay, so let's take those one at a time. The problems that you're focusing on, what's a high impact problem? The scale of the contribution, how do you make an effective or high impact contribution to solving the problem, and your personal fit for the career path. Okay, let's take those one at a time. What makes a problem a high impact problem to focus on? Well, they say that you can break this down into two components. One is that the problem has to be big, and the other is that the problem has to be neglected. Big means that the problem affects a large number of people or non-human animals in a serious way. So it's hard to assign numbers to these sorts of things, but you can distinguish a disease that affects a small number of people from a disease that affects a large number of people. Other things being equal, if the diseases are equally serious, equally deadly, and so on, it's the disease that affects a larger number of people is going to be a bigger problem. We have lots of charitable organizations in the United States devoted to the suffering of pets. So we have lots of animal shelters for pets and pounds and so on. Adoption agencies and fostering agencies, but there are more farmed animals in the world than there are pets. So, focusing on the suffering of farmed animals is a bigger problem than the suffering of pets. And indeed, the suffering of wild animals is an even bigger problem than the suffering of farmed animals. Okay. And I think in particular, the clearest examples of big problems that, you can't get much bigger than this, are problems that are what are sometimes called existential risks. So risks of destroying all of humanity, or at least of leading to the collapse of modern civilization. And in particular, some some existential risks are higher probability than others. So, maybe things like climate change or nuclear war or asteroids facing, destroying the Earth, or mass starvation after a nuclear war. So not just the death that comes from the nuclear war, but the death that comes from nuclear winter, the destruction to the environment caused by nuclear conflict. Okay, those are all higher or lower probabilities, or rather you can assign higher or lower probabilities to them, but those are all examples of possible existential risks to the existence of humanity or the existence of life on Earth, or at least to the risks that threaten the collapse of modern civilization. Okay. There are also other problems which aren't, it's not so much that they're really, horrible situations that are important to avoid. A lot of people dying from some disease, or our cities being destroyed by climate change or something like that. But it could also be that there's some great opportunity, and it's important to to capitalize on, to exploit, to capture that opportunity. So artificial intelligence might have the power to make our lives dramatically better, and perhaps make the lives of the artificial intelligence itself dramatically better. Genetic engineering might, this is very controversial. There are all sorts of questions about eugenics here that you want to get into, but at least some people think that the possibility of genetically engineering human beings to be morally better, to be more caring, maybe to live longer, more happier, healthier lives. Those are all, if we could achieve those sorts of goals, they might be, they might help make the world a much better place. Or settling space, settling Mars, settling the moon. I don't know. There are all sorts of possible sort of opportunities that could dramatically improve the life of humanity, the life of non-human animals, and it would be a shame if we had this opportunity and we failed to seize it. So when we're talking about big problems, those are all examples of big problems, opportunities to dramatically improve the lives of everybody on Earth, or nearly everybody on Earth, or risks like existential risks that threaten all of humanity, or things that are sort of more down to earth, and things that are actually happening right now that aren't just a certain probability of happening. Things like climate change, things like global poverty, or deadly global diseases of poverty that affect large numbers of people, and so on. Okay, so those are big problems. I mean, but then some problems aren't just big, but they're also neglected, which means that there aren't a lot of people focusing on them. So climate change is a big problem. It threatens to, cost, many, many trillions of dollars and lives. And if it gets bad enough it threatens, the collapse of modern civilization, I think. But it's not an especially neglected problem, because even if people aren't working hard enough on climate change, there are a lot of people working on it in different ways. People pursuing carbon capture technology, people pursuing different forms of agriculture, industrial manufacturing, and so on and so forth. But other types of problems are both big and neglected. Neglected meaning there's just not that many people working on them. So take something like up until the COVID pandemic, there were relatively few people working on techniques for developing vaccines for coronaviruses, or people working on ways of preventing or mitigating global pandemics. And, that was a neglected problem. It turns out we would have been better off if more people had been working on these things before the COVID. Wild animal suffering is a controversial, but I think a very plausible example of a big and neglected problem. There are not that many people, maybe, you know, a couple of dozen in the whole world, who are working full time on preventing suffering among wild animals, not farmed animals and not pets. Now, maybe you think there's nothing we can do, there are no effective solutions to the problem, but at the very least, it is a big and neglected problem. It's big because it affects many, many, many billions of animals, and neglected because relatively few people are working on it. Okay. So I should say, you know, the idea here is to think big. So any job that you do, with some possible exceptions, is going to have some kind of impact on the world. At least it's going to make some people's lives better. At the very least, it's going to make you some money, right? But you know, ask yourself seriously, how could you find a career that helps not just a lot of people, but the most possible people or the most possible animals? How could you find a career that doesn't just, you know, improve some people's lives in some way, but improves the most people's lives in the greatest possible way? Those are, it's you know, the answer that you're going to get is probably going to be a pretty unconventional answer. It's not going to be, if it were conventional, it wouldn't be big and neglected, right? It wouldn't be neglected anyway. If it were an obvious choice, it would not be a neglected choice. So, you know, the idea here is that when you're looking for big and neglected problems, you want to think big, and you want to think, quote unquote, outside the box. You want to think outside of what your sense of the options are for your career that you're sort of raised with. Okay. Okay, that's the first factor that 80,000 Hours says should drive your sense of, or excuse me, that shapes how high impact a career is. Does it focus on a high impact problem, and that means a big and neglected problem? Well, what about effective solutions to the problem? So, you know, climate change might be a big problem, but there are ways of fighting climate change that don't really work or don't really work very well. And there are ways that could, you know, target it much more directly. There are ways of improving the lives of non-human animals in a sort of insignificant way, or they only, you know, help a few non-human animals, or, you know, that affect billions of animals or something like that. You know, they compare, you know, things like plastic bag bans with reducing the total number of transatlantic flights, or for that matter, reducing the environmental costs of transatlantic flights. So, you know, we've had all of these discussions of banning plastic bags, and it would help contribute to, you know, it would do something to fighting, at the very least, plastic waste. Although, you know, if you replace plastic bags with cloth bags, those come with environmental costs too, and it might actually end up being worse for the environment overall. But, you know, even granting that you know, reducing the number of plastic bags used in the world to zero would do something good for the environment. You know, the amount of pollutants and the amount of energy that's released into the atmosphere, and the amount of carbon dioxide that's trapped in the atmosphere as a result of transatlantic flights is just completely outweighs, plane travel just completely outweighs plastic bags as a source of climate change and as a source of pollution. So, you know, if you had the opportunity to pick between those two ways of fighting climate change, you know, you'd pick reducing transatlantic flights if you wanted to have a high impact, at least if you had some way of effectively doing it. Okay. So it's hard to know in advance which ways of solving some problem will ultimately work. So maybe you want to, you know, maybe you want to fight climate change, and so you do some research into carbon capture, into ways of limiting the amounts of carbon that are released into the atmosphere. Now, it might just turn out that technologically once we do all of the hard work and all of the research, it's just kind of impossible to do this at any significant scale. You have to do the work to find out. So it's hard to know in advance what solutions are going to be effective, but you should try and emphasize at least plausible and neglected solutions, ways of solving problems that are have a significant chance of solving big and neglected problems, and they're solutions that other people aren't already pursuing, or they aren't already pursuing enough. One thing they point out that helps make a solution more effective is that it leverages other people. It brings in outside people and resources to help you solve the problem yourself. So, they compare being a doctor with being a public health policy worker, right? So being a doctor, who works, clinically, works seeing patients, you can only see so many patients at a time. And, you're giving each patient your attention, you're treating their problems or preventing their problems one at a time. So you can only help so many thousands of people in your career if you are a doctor working in a clinic. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do this. I'm not giving you career advice, but I'm explaining the reasoning of 80,000 hours here. But compare that with being a public health policy worker. So maybe you can figure out ways of adding nutrients to the tap water in a major city, or you can get rid of lead paint, or reduce air pollution in a city, or something like that. You could dramatically improve health outcomes for millions of people, maybe billions of people. By some estimates, one technique for growing grains that was developed in the 20th century by a Chinese scientist whose name is escaping me now, unfortunately. I should have prepared this, but what are you going to do? Has saved the lives of maybe as much as 1 billion people, because creating grains that are easier to grow, have a higher yield, and are less likely to, die to various diseases or environmental stresses. You can just prevent lots and lots of people from suffering and dying of malnutrition or famine. Okay, those are all ways of leveraging outside work and outside resources to help lots and lots of people, rather than just the individual people that you're seeing one at a time. So if you convince a city to include fluoride in its tap water so people lose fewer teeth so that they're able to stay healthy, and there are all sorts of psychological and sociological benefits that come with having healthy teeth, for example. You could improve the lives of millions of people. When working as a doctor or as a clinician, you could only improve the lives of a few thousand over the course of your whole career. Okay, so when you're thinking of effective solutions to problems, you want to think, does this really get at the heart of the problem? Does it have a strong chance of solving the problem to a significant extent? Think of transatlantic flights versus plastic bags. Does it really take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere or something like that? And one way that a problem can be, that a solution can be more effective, is that it leverages outside people and outside resources to help you. You're not just working on your own in your own little corner of the world. You are multiplying the power of your own efforts through other people's labor and other people's resources. Okay, so that's the second component of a high impact job. Big and neglected problems, important problems, big and neglected problems, effective solutions to those problems, solutions that have a high probability of really solving the problem to a significant extent, especially if they leverage the people power and resources from outside of you, that you're not just working on your own. And the third and final factor that contributes to making a job high impact is your personal fit. So is this a job are you the right person for the job? Would the job be done better if it was done by somebody, if you didn't go for it, if somebody else took the job? Is it something where you're especially highly motivated? So you're going to work harder than other people. You're going to put more care and effort into the work. Is it a job you're less likely to just burn out? Is it a job where you are that really suits your skills? That you if you have the right sort of knowledge or the right sort of personality for the job, or the right sort of moral character or something like that. Yeah. Are you the right person for the job? Or, if you didn't apply for the job, would somebody better qualified um, uh, take it and do a better job? Or not qualified in the sense of having all the right degrees or credentials or whatever, but somebody who's, has the right skills, has the right motivation, has the right mindset, has the right personality. Okay. Big and neglected problems, effective, especially high leverage solutions, and personal fit. Those are the three things that you need to consider when you are trying to find a high impact job according to 80,000 hours. You can check out the 80,000 hours job board for some examples of what they think, having done their research, what they think are, high impact careers that you could pursue, at least if you're the right fit. And I will just emphasize once more that if there's, to some extent, if there's anything that you take away from this 80,000 hour stuff, it really is just to think big. It's to think about, ask yourself seriously, how could you do the most good for the world with your career? And not asking you to be like, a saint, not asking you to sacrifice everything for other people, but just how could you do the most possible good, given your skills, given your motivation, given your inclinations, your personality, and so on. And, when you're asking that question and you're thinking big, you're not just going to look at the options that, are conventional, that everybody says, the careers that everybody already knows about. Maybe those will be the really high impact careers. But you're at least going to want to consider some possibilities that are, to use the cliche, outside of the box. Okay, that's it for Veltman, Codrerado, and 80,000 hours. Next time we will pick up with Jauch on the rat race.